أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد الأمين وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين آمين يا رب العالمين. Dear respected viewers, thank you so much for joining us back on your live show. This is Back to the Basics, and you're joining me, your host, Yahya Seymour, in which we are continuing with our previous discussion. I do not have the time today to actually give a slight prelude into where we were, and for those of you who are slightly confused, you can always refer back to the previous episodes of this show, and inshallah ta'ala everything should be clear. But we are of course continuing with our analysis of the issue of different worldviews. Today, inshallah ta'ala, we're taking one step closer to finally rounding off where we were discussing the difference between the worldview of those who believe in no God and, of course, our own worldview and how one could successfully apply a successful discussion to these differences. I began by citing a chapter from a book which I began writing approximately 4 years ago, based upon an actual conversation I did have here in this holy city of Karbala, and indeed here in this building, actually, with a person who had at one point lapsed in his faith and renounced his belief in God and was influenced by atheists who were active here at the University of Karbala. And of course, based upon how that conversation occurred and the way I approached it, I chose to transcribe the very conversation we had and compile it into a book. So I'm quoting for you one of the chapters of this yet unpublished book, and inshallah ta'ala, perhaps one day I might finish the book and choose to publish it as well, inshallah ta'ala. Now, you'll have to forgive me, of course, the book has a context, and so where I'm beginning might not have that context. I did begin quoting from it yesterday, but I wish to start once more, just in order to give the viewer that fresher in their memory, inshallah ta'ala. I can see you are frustrated. You are wondering if I wasted your time with me and have yet to hear a positive case for why I believe in God. I apologize. I felt that by giving you an introduction to me, then you may come to appreciate I'm not the typical believer that you're used to. I didn't just imitate my parents in coming to accept what I believe. So I hope my introduction has helped you in understanding a little more about me and how I was guided to God to reach the point that I have come to over 9 years ago. Now that would be approximately over 13 years ago now, but nonetheless. So now if you allow me to structure this as an argument, I shall do my best. Do I promise that it shall convince you? No, not necessarily. Yet I hope that you shall come to see that what I originally said is the case. That we both see the evidence as clear as the sun in the middle of the day. Yet our approaches to interpreting differ. I cannot lie to you and claim to be neutral. There is no such thing as neutrality on this issue. God either exists or he does not, and the law of non-excluded middle prevents there from being any neutral ground. I therefore will not pretend to be someone who claims that I am analyzing this as a neutral observer, making a conclusion from zero. I submit to you that I am certain of God's existence and that deep down you are too, although you have suppressed this knowledge and needed to be reminded of it. I see that you have gone from amused to irritated. I understand, so perhaps it's best that I now offer my case in the form of a constructed argument that you have been waiting for all this time. I apologize if you feel I have taken too long to reach this point. My argument is as follows, and I call it the proof of the thinker. Burhan al-Aqil. If you and I are having this discussion, then God exists. And you and I are having this conversation, therefore God exists. Now I see that your eyes are widening and you can't help but chuckle at my argument. Feel free to laugh at me. Since you have laughed previously at much greater things, it's not like I am more deserving of respect, yet I do ask. Please give me time to elaborate upon the premises of my arguments before dismissing me as just another crazy, radical fundamentalist believer. As I stated, if you and I are discussing this issue tonight, then God exists. And you and I are discussing this issue tonight, and therefore God exists. Because the first thing we would need in order for this discussion to occur is we would need a universe in order that we could debate within it. That requires a powerful, personal, timeless, and immaterial creator. Deists and atheists have consistently maintained throughout history that the universe itself was eternal, that is to say, going back to an eternity without a point of beginning. Contrary to Muslims and other monotheists who have maintained that the universe came into existence and was preceded by absence of existence. Thankfully, scientific discovery now affirms the Muslim perspective, and since the early 20th century, we had discovered that our universe is expanding and therefore could be traced back to have a beginning. Since this universe had a beginning, we are left with two further possibilities. Either it began to exist due to a cause, or it sprang into existence with no cause. The latter being a rational absurdity, since out of nothing, nothing comes. The consequences of believing in such an absurd theory are drastic and indeed radical. It is more rational to believe in petty magic tricks, such as magicians pulling coins from behind their ears and rabbits out of their hats, than to believe that something could magically spring itself into existence. If you submit to me that you can believe the latter, then I believe it is you who shall come across as the irrational one in this discussion. As for the former, and only feasible explanation, namely that the universe had a cause, we must think at what qualities this cause must therefore have had. This cause can neither be composed of matter nor bound by time, since both matter and time came into existence in the universe. So the cause of our universe had to be both timeless and immaterial, therefore it must be either a natural cause or a personal cause. Natural causes, of course, are the causes which we refer to when engaging in science. Personal are the kinds of causes that we refer to when there exists agency and intentionality and something chooses to do something. It cannot be scientific, as scientific explanations presuppose the laws of nature, and yet nature wasn't there to bring itself into existence. So the cause must be timeless, immaterial, and personal. The cause would also need to be powerful enough to bring the universe into existence out of nothing, and therefore we can gather from this fact alone that the cause is personal, timeless, immaterial, and of immense power. Therefore, from our temporal, finite, material universe, we know that there exists a timeless, personal, immaterial, and powerful creator. Would this be sufficient for us to have this conversation? No. In order for our conversation to be taking place, there must have been a universe which was finely tuned for intelligent life. For the forces, principles, and constants of physics, certain physical quantities of the ratio between the masses of atomic particles and the properties of elements and compounds had to be just right, or we would not be here. Without gravity, there would be no planets, stars, or galaxies, and it would be possible for you and I to sit in the way we are. Without a strong nuclear force, and protons and neutrons wouldn't be able to hold together the nucleus of an atom, and we'd only have the elements of hydrogen standing by itself on the periodic table. And without the electromagnetic force, there would be no chemical interaction between the atoms and molecules necessary for life to form. Yet the fact that we have these principles and constants is not nearly as shocking as the fine-tuning of the numbers that physicists have given for these constants. This falls under an extremely narrow range that makes our universe's facilitation possible. Now, you may, and I suspect you probably will, argue that despite the extremely low probability discussed by physicists in regard to the tuning of this universe to allow life to develop, that it is purely pot luck and random chance. I suspect that whilst this may seem reasonable to you with trying to escape the reality of God's existence, that you have not really thought about how absurd this seems. Imagine for a second that you are put in front of a box filled with 1,000,000 pieces of paper, and within that box, 1,000 of those pieces of paper have a scribble on them. You're told to put your hand into the box and blindly pull out one of them, and if it's not a scribble, the gunman will put a bullet to your head. If you do this successfully, you may be deceived into thinking this is luck. If the gunman repeats the experiment 100 times, and each time you withdraw the piece of paper with a scribble on it, I think you would probably think to yourself, someone is looking out for you, and this is not merely pot luck. If you, like me, will be honest with yourself and say that no, there are reasonable limits to what we can be we can successfully describe as luck, then you, like me, should agree that the cause of this universe clearly had us in mind with these physical constants and the fine-tuning of the universe. Fred Hoyle, a British astrophysicist, states, "A common-sense interpretation of a fact suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." So, those are two things which we needed in order to have this conversation, namely a universe and the fine-tuned constants in order for this universe to allow for life. However, just because one has a house perfectly designed to house a family doesn't mean that the family can live there. And so that brings us to our third need for this conversation, namely human life. However, what is it that we need for human life? We need complex biology. Without the biological processes going on in our bodies, without the functioning or the circulatory system, the muscular system, the nervous system, the respiratory system, and the skeletal system, our discussion would not be occurring right now. Where did these come from? Where did these systems come from? The most plausible explanation is once again design, something which we humans recognize fairly easily. Take a look around the restaurant at which we are seated, my free-thinking friend. How many of the objects around us can you list which are clearly designed? Did this building form through a process like wind and water erosion? Certainly not. I may not have seen the designer or may not know who designed these objects, but since I see evidence of design, I am certain that someone creative made these things. These are parts made for a purpose, and things like this do not happen nor form by pure chance. Yet you would think of me as irrational when, according to your view, the only things which are not designed around us are the people sitting around us and the workers here, whereas everything else is designed. Are we so much less complex than the objects in the room? I believe you know that a God exists, because I know you are smarter than someone who could believe in such apparent fables. My laptop, which I'm using, or rather the laptop I was using at the time, which probably is too old for me to even open up right now, to cite the statistics and quotes, has a fairly reasonable memory as far as electronics are considered. It could house the information contained in about 600,000 books. It's a much greater storage system than paper and ink. No doubt as the progression of technology advances, our information storage on laptops will get even greater. Yet the information storage on this laptop is an absolute joke compared to the information storage in your cells. You are alive currently because of the 60 feet of information coded in your 50 to 100 trillion cells contains information that keeps your body functioning. Dear viewers, we're going to go for a very quick break, and I'll continue citing the rest of this after that, inshallah ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, thank you for enduring that short break. Going back to where we left off, yet the information storage on this laptop is an absolute joke compared to the information storage in your cells. You are alive currently because the 60 feet of information coded in your 50 to 100 trillion cells contains information that keeps your body functioning. As biochemist Michael Denton once stated about a single teaspoon of DNA, it could contain all the information needed to build the proteins for all the species of organisms that have ever lived on the earth, and there would still be enough room left for all the information in every book ever written. Now, does it seem reasonable that a laptop that requires a designer and yet we are products of chance? You will have to forgive me for preaching here, but how true are the words of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, who stated, "A'arafakum bi nafsihi, a'arafakum bi rabbihi," that the most knowledgeable about oneself will be the most knowledgeable about God. Of course, this is to be interpreted in a light of other narrations which disavow the Sufi and mystic interpretation of such riwayat. This leads us to know that God intended for us to uncover further evidence of the magnificence of His creation through our knowledge of ourselves. Perhaps it doesn't seem to you that we were able to claim that complex information storage, which is housed in our DNA, is evidence for design. But again, if this isn't seen as too profound to be blind chance, then I have a question. And I have to question how you can consider this to be rational and free thoughts. Now, of course, some people would really take objection to what they might perceive as cockiness. And at the time, it was very civil and very humble, our conversation. But really, I think that when the atheist places the burden of proof upon the believer really needs to, again, point out that I'm not the only one that has to answer or account for anything here. Rather, you have a worldview, and let's roll with the consequences of your worldview. As the Imam tells you, قَائِدَةٌ الْإِلْزَامِ. Compel them by those principles by which they compel themselves. More importantly, that conversation continued how? I ended up pointing out that essentially another thing we needed was the ability to trust our minds, which upon atheism we could not be doing. I also pointed out that another thing we needed in order for our conversation to run smoothly was ethics. And of course, upon atheism, it's difficult to find any objective morality whatsoever. Now, in regards to those who do take objection to what I described as self-deception in this conversation, allow me to point out something which is relatively important for us to understand what I meant, and more importantly, how this pertains and relates to our conversation with atheists. We as Muslims, one accountable fact we have which provides explanatory scope in discussing why people believe in God is we believe in the concept known as the fitrah. We believe in the concept known as it's really the concept of this innate disposition upon which man is conceived and created. And this innate disposition is something that allows man to know of God's existence. So based upon that, we believe that every human being has an innate awareness of truth. And this is why the Holy Quran refers to itself as the dhikr, the reminder. Because according to our religious worldview, we believe that the Holy Prophet ﷺ came to remind people of those truths that they knew essentially, and came to bring people a message which resonated with that truth. Now, of course, there are several problems with the atheist view of religion being a crutch, or religion being something which is so superstitious, especially when we look in light of the concept of the fitrah and what certain psychological as well as psychoanalytical studies are suggesting about human beings. I possess in front of me at the moment a very important article entitled, firstly, this is published in an academic peer-reviewed journal. Now, what distinguishes an academic peer-reviewed journal from, say, a regular article published anywhere else? What distinguishes an academic peer-reviewed journal is essentially tabloid garbage cannot be published without going through a peer review system. Peer review systems, when it comes to the sciences, are slightly more rigorous than when it comes to, say, for example, the social sciences or what we would call the liberal arts. In the sense that most of the people engaging with blindly reviewing articles prior to allowing them to be published. So what happens is, the author writes an article, that article is thereafter sent to two experts in the field who that author doesn't know who they are, and they don't know who the author is either. They review the article and they suggest, is this suitable of being published? And has the author been able to sustainably demonstrate what they claim based upon the evidence provided? In the realm of sciences, this is normally done by people who are empiricists. They care a lot about evidence. So when an article gets published within the sciences, we generally know that it's not Mickey Mouse, hocus pocus, tabloid garbage, which you can find on any internet polemical website. Now, in this journal known as the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion, an article was published in the year 2013 by the following scholars: Marjana Lindman, Bethany Haywood, Tipana Reiki, and Tommy McConan. Now, of course, this is published by Marjana Lindman, who's from the Institute of Behavioral Sciences at the University of Helsinki. Of course, those of you who know Scandinavia know that Scandinavia is hardly, from the Bible Belt bastion of religious believers, is a relatively secular part of the world. It's normally cited as an atheist haven and a secular haven, to be quite frank with you. Although, of course, immigration has its problems and does create several issues. Within this article, they have entitled it, "Atheists Become Emotionally Aroused When Daring God to Do Terrible Things." What do they mean by atheists become emotionally aroused when daring God to do terrible things? They mean what happened in this particular scientific study which they conducted. In this scientific study, they gathered different categories of people. People who affirmed a strong belief in God, people who affirmed no belief in God, and people who were extreme atheists. And they asked them to read out several statements. Now, in doing so, they tied their bodies up to essentially a giant stress detector to observe the levels of stress that were occurring through the human body. Now, the statements which they were asked to read out were along the following lines. There were God statements. What do they mean by God statements? These atheists would be told to say, "I dare God to turn all of my friends against me. I dare God to make someone paralyze my mother or father," and so on and so forth. Alhamdulillah, we have this principle in Islam, نَقْلِ الْكُفْرِ لَيْسَ بِكَافِرٍ. But the one who reports or quotes kufr or statements of disbelief is not a disbeliever. So everyone knows what I mean by citing what these statements are. Then they were asked to read offensive statements. Offensive statements would be to say something provocative, such as, "It's okay to kick a puppy in the face." Then they were asked to read neutral statements, and then they were asked to read normal "I wish" statements. And these wish statements would also be quite damning. They're essentially God statements, but instead of "I dare God to do this," they would say "I wish this." So, "I wish my life was miserable." Now, what did this study find? This study found that essentially the atheists were equally as disturbed when reading the God statements as the believers. It states in study 2, atheists were also asked to say aloud the statements that were otherwise identical to God's statements. Anyway, it states, considered together, the results imply that although atheists and religious individuals' beliefs about God and explicit attitudes towards God statements are different, they become equally emotionally aroused when daring God to do unpleasant things. These results extend earlier results by demonstrating that atheists' explicit beliefs conflict with not only their behavior, but also with their effective reactions. Now, of course, they provide 4 different explanations for this, but I, as a believer, am fairly convinced I know what the explanation is. Dear viewers, thank you once more for tuning in to this show, and inshallah ta'ala, I pray that you all keep this wretched individual in front of you in your du'as. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.